Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Hazel Bryan, Professor in Education and Dean of the School of Education and Professional Development, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this Huddersfield Centre for Research in Education and Society seminar. We have a large audience today, including international participants, and it's great to see such interest in our research. In this seminar, titled Beyond the Headlines, Children, Young People and Families During COVID-19, 5 projects will be presented that our researchers have developed in response to the impact of COVID-19. If you use Twitter, the hashtag for discussion around this event is #HudCressCovid. And so, colleagues, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Jim Reid, and Jim will be presenting on mothers, COVID-19 and work at home. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Hazel. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. This research began back in March 2020, when there was lots of concern and initial worry about the impact of COVID-19 on women. A lot of discussion at the time, a lot of focus at the time was on the impact clinically on men. But there were emerging reports about how it was impacting on women's lives, particularly in relation to loss of income, increased caring responsibilities, and wider concerns, for example, for the withdrawal of reproductive services. I developed a conversation with photographer Fran Monks about the possibility of undertaking a research project. And Fran and I developed a methodology where we would recruit some participants. Fran would photograph them and I would interview them about their experiences of lockdown, first lockdown in the UK during May and June 2020. For more information about Fran's work, about the outcomes of this research, you can follow the links on this presentation, which will be supplied later. There's also a live exhibition at the Thackeray Museum of Medicine. And again, if you go to their website, you'll be able to see much more about the research. The research involved recruiting 12 mothers with school-age children who were homeschooling and who were impacted by lockdown. The women came from across England, from the north of England to the south of England, and included married women, lone mothers, adoptive mothers, and stepmothers. These were diverse families, including mothers who were in paid employment or not, some who were furloughed, and 4 of the women were key workers. Fran and I decided that our approach would be that she would take some portraits of the women, 2 portraits of each woman. The first one reflecting the woman's homeschool experience, and the second, a more personal portrait in which she reflected on her experience of lockdown. Whilst Fran did have some input into how the portrait would be staged, for example, in relation to lighting, it was really the woman's decision about what the portrait would be about and what it would represent. I'm going to share with you an example of one of the participants' portraits, Charlotte. Charlotte and I have talked about her portraits, and I do have permission to share those with you today. So this portrait is of Charlotte during a break in homeschooling with her stepson. We've talked often about metaphor in this portrait, how there's a physical barrier between her and her son. But that barrier isn't just physical. For Charlotte, she also felt it emotionally and psychologically, that there was a burden in carrying all of the responsibility that came with being in lockdown, being at home, being restricted in your movement, and having to homeschool. So space and the redefining of space and place became something that was a daily occurrence and required specific effort. Charlotte here, for example, found her spending increasing amounts of time in the kitchen and doing other forms of homework. She also found herself doing increasing amounts of emotional work, not just with her son, but also with her partner. And this is a discussion in a break between homeschooling. It's a discussion about dealing with the difficulties that her son felt in having to work online. Not everything in Charlotte's experience was negative. She did enjoy the extra time that she experienced with her son. She did enjoy the extra time that it gave them to explore different issues, different concerns, and different experiences. She did enjoy the flexibility of lockdown and the flexibility that it gave to her in her working life. And it also gave her a deeper understanding of her son's education, not just in terms of curriculum, but in terms of pedagogy. At the end of lockdown, whilst she was frustrated by the educational process, she felt better able to help. But there were also difficulties. She did find herself spending increasing amounts of time doing unpaid work at home. In managing the levels of anxiety and emotions at home, both in terms of her relationship with her son and in terms of the relationship between her son and her partner. And whilst her partner did attempt to do equal amounts of work, particularly in relation to homeschooling, she found herself many times having to intervene to mediate and manage both her son's and her partner's relationship. So this is the second of Charlotte's portraits when she's outside. And we've discussed the framing of this and the use of the window in the kitchen in a sense as if they are prison bars, because being at home and being in the house felt on many occasions like being in prison. And that gave rise to heightened levels of anxiety for her. She really craved the outside and wanted to be outside as a break from the monotony and the weight of lockdown and the responsibility and additional work that brought. Charlotte, like many of the mothers, was really surprised with the speed with which COVID-19 pushed her back into doing jobs that she thought she was sharing more equally with her partner. So one of the surprises for the majority of mothers was the speed by which they found themselves going back into more traditional type women's roles. That's how they described it. Another surprise for Charlotte and many of the mothers was a sense of loneliness and being apart. It seems a contradiction to say previously that she enjoyed spending more time both with her partner and with her son. But there was also acute awareness of being apart from other members of her family, including her own siblings and her own mother, who she yearned to be able to hug and who she yearned to be able to help her cope with her experience of lockdown. Another big surprise, and indeed a frustration for all of the mothers, was that no one in authority asked them at any stage what they needed and what would help. So this is my last slide, and I want to just mention a few things. All of the mothers were resilient. They were extremely adaptable. They adapted very, very quickly, without question, to the experience of lockdown and the additional responsibilities that they were given and they were expected to do. And I use that term expected advisedly. because it felt as if they were being taken for granted in terms of being a mother and being a woman. This is your job. So they talked about it almost being a backward step, to the 1950s or to the 1960s or 70s in terms of gender relations. Being caring and caring for others was seen predominantly as a role for the mothers and for women. But what that does is fail to recognise that these mothers and women also have care needs. And unless these care needs are discussed and foregrounded and thought about, then women are being silenced. And that silencing adds to a sense of anxiety and worry about the future. Are they going to be able to claim what they view is as necessary for themselves? Are they going to be able to claim the rights that they have experienced? Access to jobs, access to opportunities, access to services. This was particularly acute for lone mothers who had no support at home, and particularly lone mothers, for example, perhaps who had a child with a learning disability or additional needs. And when those services were withdrawn, they were dealing with poor behaviour, difficult behaviour, but also, again, services and a society that seemed not to listen to them. So to me, these mothers were the epitome of key workers during the pandemic. That wasn't recognised, but everything that they did and the way that they did it was key to maintaining equilibrium at home, in maintaining as best as possible levels of anxiety and levels of worry at home, and in maintaining good relationships at home. They all share anxiety and worry for the future. And the request that they would have of us all as we come out of the pandemic and as vaccinations begin to work is that we begin to think about, that we begin to think that the pandemic isn't over because we're all vaccinated. It's that the legacy of the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic will continue for years ahead. And a lot of that worry is around anxiety and psychological damage. And there's a key question from mothers about how that's to be managed. So Hazel, one of the things that I think I would like our audience to do is to think about that and to ponder that the pandemic doesn't end with vaccinations and with the withdrawal of COVID, that its legacy remains into the future, that women and mothers will be key in managing that, but we must consult with them, we must communicate with them, and we must think how to involve them in designing solutions for that for the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jim. I'm now going to hand over to Helen Lomax, Professor of Childhood Studies and Director of Research. And Helen is going to speak on Where Am I? Where Are the People Like Me? Children's Everyday Lives and Educational Experiences During the Coronavirus Pandemic. Helen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hazel. And thank you, Jim. That was really interesting. And there's lots of really interesting connections, I think, with my work. So it's my pleasure to be here presenting on behalf of the team that lists on the PowerPoint. So the project, Children Researching Their Everyday Lives, Education and Relationships During the Coronavirus Pandemic, also known as CHEER, has been co-produced with 4 primary schools in Yorkshire and Humber, working closely with 16 primary school children in Year 5, now in Year 6, since the first national lockdown in spring 2020 to the present, and we're continuing to work with those children. So the research has been co-designed with the schools, with the teachers, with the parents, with the children. It's iterative and responsive to their needs and to the changes in that are happening in the pandemic and policy responses to that. It's been kindly funded by an internal university grant and also generously by the schools who've contributed to the costs of our artist, Belinda Wall. So thank you to them for that. So the presentation, it's obviously very short, so I can only, and I'm really hoping to do this, give you a flavour of the research context, so why we needed to do this research with children at this time, the methods that we developed for researching remotely with children, and a flavour of the initial findings. But to note, we're still working with the children, and our outputs will and are being produced with them as we go along in the form of a digital animation and a zine. So it's just a taste at this point. Okay, so research context, the silencing and marginalisation of children. So as we all know, UK schools closed a year ago at the start of the first national lockdown, with the announcement by the PM that schools would close for all children except the most vulnerable and children of key workers. And this period has seen children unable to attend school, meet with friends and see family they don't live with. And at this time in the UK, and more particularly in England, we've seen children barely addressed directly by government. So under 18s were prohibited from submitting questions to the government's daily COVID briefing and not addressed directly by the PM at all until July, well after the first phase of the pandemic had started. A position which undermines children's rights to articulate their views. And at this time, schools and parents, as we've heard from Jim, most notably women, rapidly reorganised in order to support children as technology became the primary means of teaching and setting schoolwork, and for children themselves to meet with family they didn't live with and to speak and hang out with friends. However, the impacts of lockdown on children have not been evenly felt, with many academics and third sector organisations predicting disproportionate negative impacts on the most disadvantaged children. So for this reason, we were particularly keen to work with schools who are located in some of the most disadvantaged localities in the UK. And as Julie Spray and Jean Hunley's note, the particular experience of children in this context of existing and emerging conditions of inequality remain unexplored. So it was really important to include in the sample of children children who were experiencing material or socioeconomic disadvantage. Okay, so next, the aim of our research was to hear directly from children. However, of course, in this we were challenged by the conditions of the pandemic, whereby we couldn't meet with children in person. So we worked with our 4 partner schools to design research iteratively in order to enable children to generate their own creative data about their lives. So the research is organised broadly into 3 phases. Phase 1, we've used creative visual arts, so animation, collage, comic strip, drawing, craft, photography and filmmaking, both to communicate with children about the research, about what we're trying to achieve with the research, and also to enable them to participate and to create their own data that's meaningful to them. So the aim was using these methods to enable children to chronicle their experience over a period of 6 weeks in England. So you can see an example of the way that we communicated the project to children at the outset of the project.
Hello, my name is Helen and this is Kate. We are researchers from the University of Huddersfield. We want to find out what life has been like for you during the coronavirus pandemic. We know that for most of you, life has been very different. We haven't been able to go to school as usual, go to the park or meet our friends. We are asking children in Year 5 in your school, and in some other schools too, to complete some creative activities which show us what life has been like for you. You might decide to take photos, draw or paint a picture, create a collage, write a poem, produce a video or a sound recording, make a zine or a comic strip, or a combination of these or something else that we haven't thought of. If you'd like to take part, please tell your adult at home. They will receive a letter from us about the project and a consent form, which you will both need to sign and return. Once you've done that, you can get started.
So in that digital animation, we used a lot of sound to communicate as well, using music, using our voices to explain the project, how children might participate. Okay, so after the children had watched that first animation and signed up to take part in the project, we produced an animation a week, and they were posted on the school's learning platforms in a closed area for the participating children, for them to focus on things they've noticed, their relationships, their learning, their physical activity, the environment, and giving as important dimensions of well-being. And as you've seen from the animation, the idea was that there'd be these categories were flexible and designed to get children, to enable children to reflect and to prompt them to reflect on things that were happening to them, not to be prescriptive. Phase 2 of the project, we then, in the autumn term, carried out a series of image elicitation interviews with the children. And in phase 3, we're working with the children to produce art with them based on their reflections and their thoughts about the ongoing pandemic and lockdown. And to do, obviously, this involves considerable co-production and work with the schools and with parents, and including sending art packs to home and to school, setting up Zoom at home and at school in order to create an inclusive space for children to express their ideas. Okay, so what did the children tell us? Okay, so we've divided, for the purpose of this paper, the findings are organised around 4 areas which children told us were important. And these were concerned with children's voices, learning, relationships, and the importance of the outdoors. Issues of inequality and social justice are included and thread across these categories. So the first of these, children's voices, and just to say that we're using pseudonyms to protect the identity of the children in this presentation. So children express their agency using textual and visual data. They were very clear about the impact of the pandemic on them, their friends and their family. They had a lot to say about what it felt like, as you can see from Hannah's quotation here, how it was different from non-pandemic, from before the pandemic, what was actually good about the pandemic, particularly at the start of the pandemic, and what was difficult. Children also expressed through their artwork, as you can see in the picture, confusion and feeling left out of the conversation about the conversation about the coronavirus pandemic. They describe being shocked at the sudden move to homeschooling following the PN's announcement, and they posted pictures of closed parks and described their anxiety about what this meant for them and for those around them. Children's learning. Children again were very clear about what helped and what was difficult. And as the quotation from Dylan here indicates, they missed in-person support from teachers, preferred live lessons where they could work with a teacher. So that was really important for children to have that contact with teachers, and they were pleased to have it when they could. Not all parents could help their children, as this quotation from Gemma suggests. Some parents were able and had the resources to be super organised. Others, as Dylan's quotation suggests, were not able to offer that support. Some children struggled with some of the work. They worried and used phrases like becoming brain dead and rusty. But other children challenged themselves with hard maths and learned the recorder and read more widely. School is not just about formal learning, of course. School It's an opportunity for children to take on, particularly in year 5 and 6, more leadership roles to support other children, younger children, in sporting activities. And they lost and missed that opportunity and told us that. Children miss their friends, they miss contact with children that happens at school, and hence Gabby saying she preferred a space where she could actually communicate with children rather than an asynchronous form of online learning. But children had different material resources, so some children were able to access extracurricular lessons, others were not able to do that. They didn't have the resources to do that. Okay, children were resourceful. They developed techniques to manage their school day, developing tactics such as finishing early in order to go and play in the garden with their siblings, and to cook and to walk and to do things with nature. Now, I'm told that I've got very little time left. The relationships, and I would just quickly say that the importance of relationships was very clear throughout the project, with children articulating just how important it was to spend time with family, and how difficult it was when they couldn't do that. But again, developing really quite interesting ways of, and really quite clever ways of managing social distancing. So going to see Grandad and throwing chocolates through a window, his favourite chocolate through a window, organising a quiz and a bingo night, or hanging out of the bedroom window in order to chat with a next door neighbour. But other children weren't able to see their friends or access their friends because they didn't have a digitally enabled, the internet enabled technology in order to do that. Okay, I'm going to leave, skip the outdoors, even though it's incredibly important. I hope you look at it when we get access to the slides. But just to sum up then, and of my concluding remarks, children were very clear about what was supportive of their mental and physical well-being and their learning, had a really clear idea about the importance of green space, being out there in nature, and be able to connect with nature and help them deal with difficult feelings and anxiety. Children were very resourceful at making the best of things as well, and enjoyed some elements of lockdown, particularly at the start. So children have a lot to tell us about what helps, but also a lot that we can learn from them about what's important. They have ideas about the future. However, they're not being directly spoken to or listened to by those making the rules. And what we've tried to do in our research is to pay close attention to children's voices, to create a space for them to do that. And our next step is to work with children to explore how you might identify ways to do this. So thank you very much for listening.
Very many thanks, Helen. Colleagues, we're now going to move on to Robert MacDonald. Robert is Professor of Education and Social Justice, and he's going to talk on Pressure Now and Pressure to Come, the COVID-19 pandemic, inequality and young people in the northeast of England. Over to you, Rob.
Yes, thank you, Hazel. That's the title. This is the research team. It's a group effort. So there's Emma Murphy, Hannah King, Wendy Gill, Simon Bees at University of Durham, and Duncan Fisher at Teesside. The project was motivated really by observations early on in the pandemic and the lockdown that young people were often talked about, but rarely were they talked to. There seemed to be a structured absence of young people's voices and experience. So we launched the Youth Lockdown Project in combination and in collaboration with youth work agencies, the North East Youth Alliance and Children North East, and with some support and funding from the Youth Futures Foundation. We're very grateful to all those organisations. So the aim was to understand better or hear from the experiences of young people in the northeast of England. We have so the focus is moving here from children to young people. We have quite a long age range, 30 years old. Our two main methods were an online survey, and we asked a simple question, which was asking young people about their experiences of lockdown and the crisis. We were pleased with the response. It was a solid response. We had about 938, we had exactly 938 respondents. Good coverage by gender, by ethnicity, by place across the Northeast, and by age across that age. And that's what I'm mainly going to be talking about today in terms of findings, is what the survey told us. 150 of those people, survey respondents, volunteered to take part in interviews, and that process with a subsample of those people is ongoing currently. Now, I'm going to cram in some main headline findings that came from the survey, and I'm trying to get a sense for you of the current pressures that are bearing down on young people as reported to us through the online survey. So young people talked about relationships a lot. They talked about relationships with their parents, with siblings, and sometimes these were improved. People feeling that they were enjoying having more time with siblings, with parents, but often these were strained relationships, and those relationships were often strained because of pressures of space, privacy. We don't talk much about gardens and space in youth sociology as an aspect of inequality, but perhaps that is a new form of inequality that the survey revealed. People talked about missing their friends, a sense of loneliness and isolation, and getting lost in Netflix days, a sense of loss of time, a loss of time structure. So one young woman talked about, I've lost my part-time job, so every day consists of waking up at 3 o'clock, doing nothing but binge watching Netflix and going to bed at 3 a.m. The same life every day, talking to barely no one except my girlfriend and parents. This was a main theme: worry, uncertainty, and insecurity. Insecurity about and worry about disrupted education, about jobs that had been lost or jobs that might not be got in the future, insecurity of income for those on furlough, and a general sense of anxiety about the future. There were some hints at class inequalities in the things that young people said in terms of well-known things like digital divides and digital access, also in terms of the forms, the quantity and quality of educational provision that young people received. A main finding or a main theme in terms of the quantity of comments that were gained about this, that were received about this, related to, well, what we can call ill-being rather than well-being, a widespread sense and expression of ill-being, of anxiety, of stress, of depression. Those are some of the main headline findings from the survey so far. I think as youth sociologists, one of the things we do is try to put young people's experiences in terms of what's happening now in a sense of time, what's happening in the youth phase of transitions to adulthood, and also putting them in the context of social structure and of economy. So it's important to think about the impact of this pandemic, but also where young people were before then. And this really wasn't a very good time to be a young person. So this was a precarious context for youth transitions. Young people have faced long-term wage stagnation, rising youth unemployment through the 2000s and 2010s. Youth poverty, the insecurity of jobs and income associated with the gig economy, and for many young people, the apparent impossibility of home ownership. The 2008 global crash returned us to talk of a new lost generation, and young people as a generation now are the first since the Second World War to face a greater likelihood of downward social mobility than upward social mobility. Had a set of austerity cuts which hit young people particularly hard. The loss of the educational maintenance allowance, sure start services, youth services, disentitlement to benefits, and so on. And some commentators talk about how Brexit was just another strand of this, the betrayal of the younger generation by the old. And now we have a collapsing labour market, the worst hit, the worst recession, the worst decline in 300 years, far worse than the impact of the global financial crash in 2008. This is just one headline from last summer that I spotted. as 4,228 people applied for one entry-level job. There was an example from the research area that we're talking about, Northumberland, which had well over 3,000 people applying for a warehouse worker job. When you have a bad economy and a bad hit on an economy, it's particularly bad for young workers because they're the new entrants to the labour markets. Those are the most insecure anyway. So young people, young workers, counting here people who are not full-time students, have faced much higher rates of redundancy, job loss and furloughing. A third of 18 to 24-year-olds are in this situation. And the Centre for Economic Performance talk about the potential long-term scarring effects on young people. What they mean by that is, you know, rather like Jim was talking about in terms of the legacy of anxiety for mothers, what we're pointing to here is the legacy of damaged economic prospects for young people. So the Resolution Foundation, using the experience and data and knowledge that we gained from what happened to young people and youth transitions in the after the 2008 crash, and applying econometric modelling, predict that post-crisis, after the crisis, employment prospects for graduates are going to be 13, and for lower skilled workers, they're going to be 37% lower. So we're talking about the long-term prospects here for young workers. So we can talk about the pressures of now, and the things that we report in our survey are not dissimilar to things that are reported in other emergent research. But one of the questions we want to ask is, well, what's going to come for young people? What's next? So to finish, to summarise, I'll point to 5 conclusions. That the survey pointed to how young adults' experiences can confound popular stereotypes. They're worried about the effect of COVID on their loved ones, on their parents and grandparents. They're sometimes worried about the effect of COVID on themselves. A number of our respondents were key workers. You don't often think about young people being key workers. There were shop assistants and delivery drivers, and 1 or 2 were teachers. So, and for these sorts of reasons, strongly in support of lockdown and lockdown rules and restrictions, again, something which perhaps confounds some of the media representations of youth. Second, indicated widespread mental distress amongst young people. There is quite a lot of research now, particularly with children and adolescents, and this is one of the dominant findings that's coming out of ongoing research in the pandemic. Young people's accounts pointed to old inequalities that we know quite a lot about, but also hinted at some new inequalities of experience. Fourthly, a main point that we're making is that the COVID-19 crisis adds to the mounting problems that young people already faced. Yeah, the crisis is added to the precarity of youth transitions to adulthood, and this hints at and points to, signals the heavy pressures that are to come for young adults. We need then research and policy, which Young Citizens UK used the phrase a youth-led recovery. The Children's Commission, I think this week, talked about a beverage report for children. Last year, before the pandemic hit, Eldin Farmy, myself and Hannah King were writing about the need for a manifesto for the social welfare of young adults, given the extent and seriousness of long-term problems that they're facing. So anyway, look, that's a brief, quick run through of some of our findings. Thank you for listening. Back to you, Hazel.
Thank you very much, Rob. Well, colleagues, let's just take stock for a moment. We've heard so far from Jim, who's talked through issues for mothers. We've heard from Helen, who's talked through the issues around young children, and from Rob, who's turned around issues for, who's talked to issues for young people during this time. We're now going to listen to Dr. Kate Lavender and Dr. Cheryl Reynolds, who are going to talk through the implications for schools in North Halifax of COVID-19 homeschooling experiences on the most disadvantaged pupils. So over to you, Kate and Cheryl.
Thanks, Hazel, and thanks for having us here today. So we're going to talk through some of our recent research in North Halifax that we've done with participating schools. And the first thing to say really is that, well, thank you, because the research has been funded by the North Halifax cluster of primary schools and the University of Huddersfield. And the research is in some ways a response to some of the larger scale research that has been carried out into the experiences of disadvantaged children in the wake of COVID, and a desire to understand perhaps the more context specific and local impact that COVID has had in this particular area. So we were focusing mainly on the local and the practical outcomes, and wanted to consider how we might develop curriculum interventions to support these schools and their pupils. With that in mind, the research is action research, and we take a position from McTaggart, which is that action research is not a method or a procedure, but a series of commitments to observe and problematise through practice. So with that in mind, with the schools, it's very much been participatory in a sense, and for that reason we've been able to form a self-reflective inquiry, and that has enabled us to understand what's going on in these schools better. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about the schools. So on this slide here, we had 4 schools that have participated in the case study, and the first school is an inner city school, which draws its pupil population from disadvantaged areas. The secondary schools, which are the ones on the left and top and bottom, are not inner city schools, but are schools that reside around areas of deprivation, and again draw their pupil population from there. And interestingly, the fourth school is actually a rural school, and it's a contrasting school in the sense that it has more affluent children that attend that school. And when Cheryl talks about the findings, she'll explain a bit more about the significance of that. Okay. So as part of the research, we undertook teacher interviews, and that's where the main findings of today's presentation are going to be drawn from. And again, in consultation with the schools, we found that one of the biggest practices that have been shaken by the pandemic was those around transitions from year to year. So we decided that we would interview teachers in pairs, so that was reception in year 1 and then year 5 and 6 teachers, so that we could get an understanding of the challenges involved in those transitions and how they'd managed that in the first lockdown, which is when that was occurring. Okay. Now, what's to come is that we're going to be in focus groups with children. As you can see on the photo there, Cheryl is zooming into a classroom, and because of the situation at the moment, it's not considered safe to go into schools. It's likely that this means that we will have to try and do these things digitally. That being said, again, with the head teachers and teachers in the schools, we've designed some methods to try and collect data with children. So our younger children, we're going to use visual arts-based methods, and with the older children, we're using literary and language-based methods, and that's to help them articulate their experiences in an age-appropriate way. Okay. And the final method that we're using is parent interviews. And again, so we'll be doing these digitally or online. And that's to understand, I suppose, the breadth of experiences amongst the children and the teachers and the parents in the schools. So I'm going to now hand over to Cheryl, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the initial findings from our interviews with teachers.
Thank you, Kate. I think the first thing to mention is, what a privilege it's been to talk to these teachers and how much we've learned from them. And they're very complex field in which they're currently working. The key thing that we found, as I think all of the researchers here have found, has been around multiplicity and complexity. It's such a complex picture. It was complex anyway, but layered on top of that have been these very different circumstances for children at home, and some of them coming into school at different rates. And so it's been kind of a divergent experience for children. So even where they were experiencing similar circumstances at home, their response to it was very different depending on their character and disposition and so on. So a very uneven effect on the children and on the parents and on the relationship between the children and the parents. So we've seen a broadening of the challenge to schools. So circumstances that were different were around health, the health of the children and their families, parents' infection concerns, income and living conditions, their caring responsibilities, their employment, the availability of technology at home, the availability of space at home, and how much quietude they had in order to attend online sessions. So all of that has really swamped the teachers' efforts to maintain any kind of continuity of curriculum plans or any kind of differentiated approach that respond to children's learning needs. They're still working hard at that, and they're deploying their efforts, and it's huge what they've been able to achieve. But nonetheless, the challenge is so great that it's impossible, I think, for them to meet that complexity at the current time. So that, we think, has resulted in a series of losses, and the teachers spoke incredibly movingly about some of that loss, and there's a real sense of grief around some of these things, and particularly around the most hard to reach children, where there's been minimal contact through homeschooling and then minimal attendance when the children have been expected and able to come back into school. And the teachers spoke about their fierce desire to help those children, but the frustration of being unable to do so. And that was significant across all of the different schools that we spoke to. Also, losses around behaviour and socialisation. So, knowing how to take your shoes and coat on and off and hang it on the hook, or table manners during lunch hour, or also around the children's behaviour to do with, irritability, being very tearful, being aggressive, some regression of skills, for some children very clingy behaviour and wanting to be with the teacher all the time, for others withdrawal, and then in some disturbing cases some self-harm, where a child had been very happy before the pandemic and it seems entirely associated with what's happened during lockdown. So some really distressing things that are happening in schools. Also for children, loss of friendship groups, and that in part has been to do with the effect of bubbles on shared spaces within the school. So children have been put in different bubbles and they can't get to their friends and be friends with the people that they were friends with before. And also neighbourhood effects, that where children are in lockdown, the ones who are not living close to their friends are left out, because those friendship groups persist even when they're not supposed to. Those children are playing out and they're together, and then you're isolated from that and you're missing out. So that fear of missing out and that experience of missing out was very strong for some children. And then a massive one was rites of passage, that they'd lost all of those wonderful celebrations that you have in school, where it's an important point in the child's life where they're moving on to something or they've achieved something wonderful, and the inability to celebrate that was deeply felt by the teachers, and they say it was also deeply felt by the students. So those are some of the losses, but there have also been some very unexpected and significant gains that were really interesting. So relationships with home, this was fascinating, that particularly for the more rural school, the strength of the relationship with home has just been really significant. So the fact that the parents have a renewed respect for what teachers do and an appreciation of it, they can see them teach, they can see how good they are, and they are starting to get involved in that a lot more, and that's been wonderful. But again, very uneven. So for others, the relationship with parents has become vexed and or absent. So they've just dropped out of the loop and it's very hard to reach some parents. So the dynamics of online learning have been really interested, and parental involvement, and that's been key for some children, and they've learned more quickly and more effectively because of that. Some children who were very reticent in the classroom are more vocal online, and teachers spoke about the power of a back channel, that where a child wouldn't be willing to speak out in the classroom, they are willing to send a little private message to the teacher. And so teachers have felt a closer sense of connection with some children. That's been fascinating. They also spoke really powerfully about freedom in the curriculum, that being liberated from key stage tests and SATs tests has meant that they could do all sorts of really interesting, engaging and relevant individualised projects with class groups or even with individual children, which have then had some parental input. And these are teachers who, prior to this, were real strong believers in SATs and the importance of SATs, but they've had a kind of sea change in the way that they think about that. And then finally, the digital expertise of the teachers, the children, the parents, that's been a huge gain. So finally then, the third area that I want to just briefly talk about is the strategies that have come out of this. And this is where the research is aimed at, and we're just beginning to dig into this, and we're really keen to work with the schools as we move through and we find out more about how we can start to look at these strategies and build upon them. So proactive communications with home, including outreach. That has been hampered by fears and infection risks, but the schools have got a lot more expertise around that now, and new strategies that they've developed that we think are interesting and worth sharing. Also, resources to the home, both digital and physical, that they've had some really important lessons around that and how to manage it. And also a really key one is kind of sensitivity to the emotional world of the child. Teachers have always been great at this, but they are honing their ability there. They're developing more skills around that. And as Kate says, those have been around art-based approaches, getting children to express what's going on for them through art and through language-based methods as well. And that's one of the reasons why our research is going down that same kind of avenue to explore that. And then finally, the online pedagogies, that they have all this expertise now, and they're beginning to wonder about, what about when children are back in school? Is it back to where we were before? Or are there elements of those online pedagogies that we can keep and that we can exploit? Where we've seen a benefit to the child and their learning, can we develop and build upon that even further? So that's as much as I wanted to say. There's all sorts of other things that we'd like to share, so anybody who wants to contact us afterwards, please do so. But thank you for listening. I'm going to hand back to Hazel at this point.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you, Cheryl. Well, colleagues, we're going to hand over now to Dr. Lisa Russell, and Lisa's going to talk to us about homeschooling, a parent's perspective in the advent of COVID-19. Over to you, Lisa.
Okay, thanks, Hazel. Today, what I'm going to do is talk about some emerging findings about a project called Homeschooling, a Parent's Perspective in the Advent of COVID-19. This was a university research funded project, and the project itself aimed to identify how parents were managing homeschooling in the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also to explore what homeschooling felt like from a parent's perspective. And I really wanted to look at benefits and challenges that the homeschooling experience entailed. It took a critical participatory action research frame, whereby reciprocity between the researcher, so that being myself in this case, and the participants, parents and teachers, was given prominence. So decisions about what to explore and what to change were taken collectively. So what I tried to do was open up what chemists and McTaggart call communicative spaces, whereby parents and teachers could reflect together on the character, conduct and consequences of their homeschooling practices and experiences. So findings were regularly fed into governing board meetings, and there is a report available. If anybody's interested in that, do get back in contact after this session and I can provide that for you. So within this frame, parents are recognised as experts in their own lives. They're viewed as key stakeholders who have important experiences to share. The project itself is cyclical in nature, so it captures in real life time what was happening in a ever-changing, fast-changing education landscape. Each of the three cycles correspond with bouts of regional and national lockdown, but also corresponded to times where families were coming out of periods of isolation. Even when schools went back to school, there were certain year groups and bubbles sent back. A total of 35 interviews were conducted via the online platform of Zoom, and that included 29 mothers and 3 teachers. We also collected 30 images that depicted what homeschooling felt like from the parents' point of view. Just a little bit of context around the school. It's a small village voluntary aided mixed primary school located in rural northwest of England. It has about 4 mixed age classes with just over 100 pupils on roll. Most of the pupils there are of white British heritage. There's a low proportion of children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds here, but a higher proportion of pupils with a statement of special educational needs or an education, health and care plan. This was viewed as a site of exemplary practice in terms of its delivery of homeschooling, with some families purposely moving their children from other local schools to this school in between different lockdown periods in anticipation of further bouts of homeschooling. So just a little bit as well about the context. You know, we know that on Friday, the 20th of March, schools across England were closed until further notice, except, of course, to the children of key workers and vulnerable children. Amidst the preparation for shutdown, schools had to quickly set up new ways of working. In July, Gavin Williamson revealed plans for all schools and colleges to reopen in full with COVID-19 secure measures in place. So schools were asked to reorganise themselves by keeping children in class or year group bubbles. And then at the beginning of the year, after just one day's return after the Christmas holiday, Boris Johnson announced another national lockdown. And then at the beginning of this month, we saw all school children return to school. So what we experienced there was this national shift to remote learning. So from March 2020, the vast majority of children were actually being homeschooled by their parents. And a significant number of those parents felt unconfident about their ability to homeschool. Lots of parents talked to me about, you know, I'm not a teacher. And so there was a worry there for some parents. So I think it's really important to try and explore the parents' perspective. As the research unfolded, studies such as this co-space study here started to report on the issues around parental mental health and how that was worsening under the latest COVID-19 restrictions. Just to quickly summarise some of the key findings, which are organised around parents and teachers and what they thought were important. Many of the parents talked about this juggling act where they were trying to balance homeschooling and employment in amongst other domestic responsibilities. There certainly was a theme of gendered division of labour, where in the majority of cases it was the females or the mothers of the household that were executing the homeschooling. Feelings of fatigue, guilt and anxiety were commonplace, but they were interspersed with this feeling that actually people were going through a unique family experience. And there was also some issues around changing use of technology, where some parents were a little worried about their children's increased use of screen time, but also saw the advantages in the different ways that children, in fact, that we were all using technology at that time. Here we've got an image that one of the working mothers shared with us, and she describes this image as complete carnage. So I asked parents to supply an image that depicted homeschooling from their point of view, and there was lots of pictures around shared workspaces where working parents were sharing their dining room tables, and so there's a whole array of empty yogurt pots, sun cream, iPads, work that the mother was doing, but also work that the school children were doing as well. So again, coming back to this theme of competing space. Again, there was this gender division of labour, so managing this day-to-day household tasks where caring responsibilities, employment and the organisation, delivery and execution of the homeschooling was largely but not exclusively conducted by mothers, and explanations for this largely lie in the gender division of paid labour, with the father's employment often given prominence due to its higher paid and more secure status. So one mother here talks about how she had to completely change her working pattern. She says, I have 3 children, I'm self-employed and I've stopped taking on projects. So I'm currently not working. I have one project potentially going to start in a couple of weeks, and we've taken that decision because my husband's working within the NHS. He's not a frontline worker, but he is supporting the NHS and he's in full-time work. And I knew that I was not going to be able to support 3 children through primary school homeschooling and try and keep my consultancy practice running at the same time. So I've just had to let it go for now, which is devastating. So many parents talked about experiences of ups and downs throughout the longevity of the homeschooling, and there was one mother here who showed an image of the Incredible Hulk, and she aligned herself to feeling like the Incredible Hulk. And in her interview, she talks about this fictional character who has two sides to their personality. And she talks and articulates quite nicely how in one moment, you know, she's feeling like she's full to capacity and burst into the seams. And, you know, if she didn't have the right ingredient for tea, that would absolutely drive her crazy. And then in another moment, she had periods of calm where she was enjoying the time, watching her son draw. So feelings of fatigue, guilt and anxiety were often interspersed with moments of joy. And many parents recognised this as a special, unique family time that enabled parents to watch their children grow and deviate from the restrictions of the national curriculum and learn other important life skills like learning how to ride a bike or learning about local geography or cooking or something like that. One mother here, she talks about how she was working in the moors, so she took her work up on the moors, and the homeschooling she did alongside that with her daughter Tammy. So technology enabled her to do this, and she talks about this being a unique family experience. And that's her daughter there up in the moors as they're both doing their work together. And she says, "I'm enjoying this. I'm closer to Tammy now than I've ever been because I've got the time. I'm doing stuff with her that I wouldn't, you know, we come from a separated home. So actually Tammy's in school and then she spends every other weekend with her other parents. So I feel like I've just got more time with her than I would normally have had, and I'm cherishing it." The pandemic resulted in the rapid adoption of digital technology across schools with significant changes in the delivery of learning. Parents recognised the educational and social benefits their children's use of technology could bring, but they also voiced concerns over their children's increased level of screen time and a recognition of inequalities that could ensue against those children who had access to those resources, which included technology, but also outdoor space and parental time, and those that didn't. So just to conclude, what we see is that parents have experienced challenges juggling various work and caring commitments. Families experience lockdown and homeschooling in different and unequal ways, with most experiencing moments of ups and downs throughout the longevity of the process. Feelings of fatigue, stress and anxiety were commonplace, but spending time together as a family was really cherished, and parents expressed feelings of nostalgia and enjoyed watching their children grow and be free from the constraints of the national curriculum and have the time to learn other real life skills and engage with nature. There were concerns around increased screen time, but parents recognised again that this was a unique moment in time and that recognised that the different ways and increased ways that young people were using technology. There is a top tips for parents poster as schools reopen to more children that's developed in response out of this project. It's freely available to anybody who can make use of it. The image there's a bit blurry, but you can download that if you want to, and these slides will be made available after if you want to pick that up. And then those are just the references, and that's my final slide and all from me.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, it's now time to hand over to Catherine Jensen from the Hudcrest Research Development Team, and Catherine is going to facilitate the Q&A session. So over to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Hazel. There's been some great questions that have come through. The presenters have been very busy and actually answered most of the questions in the chat. So I've scrolled through and I've picked out a few. So first, I just want to go back to Helen Lomax. I think there's a great kind of comment from Jenny Hallam around outdoors, and I just wondered whether Helen would be able to maybe talk a bit more about the importance of access to outside space. And Jenny's making a point around how it actually, what is the issues around feeding inequality and issues around that. Helen.
Thank you, Jenny. That's a really important question. And access to the outdoors and to nature was incredibly important for all the children. It was mentioned by everybody. but it ranged in what I think, as I've sort of tried to indicate with some of the other categories of finding, children make the best of what they've got. So for some children, they might have had only a very tiny garden, but they still were able to plant vegetables or create a bee garden. So yes, so issues of inequality were important, but children sort of found a way through that. But then, but also in their discussion with us, recognise that other children are less fortunate. So some children wouldn't even have had access to even a very small garden. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. I'll just ask if I can ask just Cheryl or Kate to just comment a bit further. There's a question from Alice Little around the potential for using the experience during the lockdown, where parents became more engaged in their children's learning to create opportunities in the future. I think Cheryl's just answered a bit, but I think it's quite an interesting question, and maybe just say a little bit about that, if you, Cheryl or Kate or both.
Yeah, I think this was one of the more exciting outcomes, that you could see it actually in the interview with the teachers, where they were reflecting on what had happened and maybe even sort of talking it through for the first time and starting to say, oh, do you know what, we could think about how we could use that. We could do something like that next year, or we could do something like that to end the term. So they definitely they're beginning to see that potential. And I think that's something we definitely want to tap into with the next phase of the research. When we've done with the data gathering and we've formulated our findings, we're then going to go back to the school, and part of the funding from the North Halifax cluster that we're so grateful for is that it will release teachers from time in school to come and work with us, and to work together, more importantly, to try to pick up on some of the things that we've learned and to come up with some interventions. So these 4 schools are part of a cluster of 19 schools. So in the first instance, those resources will be shared across the whole cluster, which has funded us, but then hopefully they'll have a wider applicability as well and can be shared more widely.
Thanks. There's a question from Kath Shackleton, which I think could be to anyone, but I might kick it off to Rob to start with, if that's okay. I think it's quite a difficult question. It's sort of Kath Shackleton is talking about what initiatives are there currently for young people, children and families to help them recover, and how can we help to lobby for the support needed? And I'm thinking particularly about, Rob, maybe the project and the involvement of the organisations.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Catherine. Yeah, it is a tricky question. One of the findings from the survey that we've done so far, I wouldn't put too much stress on it because we didn't ask specifically about it. It's just something we noticed that young people reported very little contact with services. There was virtually no discussion in the 938 survey responses about the extent to which people were engaged with welfare services, youth services and so forth, apart from school, not discussion about school. And we know from, not just from our research, but from some extensive, rigorous, more psychologically oriented and longitudinal studies that are ongoing, that it's probably not too extreme to talk about a mental health crisis amongst young people in relationship to the pandemic. That was a phrase that was used even before the pandemic. So I think we are seeing, an increase in demand at a time when services are very much overstretched. So I think one of the things that we should be looking at in policy terms very seriously is the way that we can bolster and support and develop and improve mental health services and provision for children and young people. That's the first thing I would say. One of the things I'd also add is that, we've been working in collaboration with North East Youth Alliance and Children North East. And they, and one of the benefits of that collaboration is that they can ask us questions to ask, and we can feed back to them, and we can develop our research in collaboration. So one of the things they're keen to know from us is how better might youth services or youth work develop, what sort of particular sorts of needs that young people face. So that's a benefit of working in collaboration with agencies like that. I suppose the last thing I would say is that, continuing with the main theme of my talk was it's young people who've been most dramatically hit economically by the pandemic, by the lockdown, and it is those people who are going to face the biggest challenges, young people, young adults in the labour market, in terms of trying to make transition to adulthood and into secure employment. So as and when furloughing comes to an end, there are going to be some really quite serious socioeconomic problems and issues facing young adults, which we need to address with some urgency. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. I think we just have maybe time for one last question and reflection. And I think there's quite a few people commenting on the arts-based method. So I wanted to just throw it over to Jim Reid. If you could talk a bit more about the advantages of using photography in terms of capturing the experiences.
Thanks, Catherine. Of course, the use of portraiture was only one example of arts-based methods that were on show this afternoon. The portraits were particularly used with mothers, but Helen's work obviously showcased, as have Cheryl's work, Lisa's work, work with children in a variety of settings, and the importance of using a variety of methods and the possibilities that arts-based methods and creativity offers to gathering in-depth and insightful data, but also working with children and young people and people otherwise in very difficult circumstances in a caring and ethical way. I think it's important to say that the use of the portraits was really important for me in enabling the voice of the mothers to be heard. We could have quite straightforwardly held a series of interviews online and developed some very good qualitative data. But our view was that it wouldn't tell the whole story. And it came to that conclusion in looking at some of Fran's existing work and what was being revealed in the portraits that she had taken prior to my research or our research beginning. In fact, I came across Fran's work following a news story on the BBC, where she was looking at people's experiences of COVID-19. And these were very powerful images, because you got to see behind the words, you got to see the person in the actuality of their experience. And what was really important for us in framing the portraits was that the women themselves were able to say where the portrait should be taken, what the circumstances of the portrait were. Yes, Fran, as I said earlier, had some input in relation to lighting, for example. But the portrait told the woman's story in a different way to the interviews. That is, that the interviews and the portraits both supported the other. So I think the use of image and use of creative methods is particularly powerful in listening to and hearing people's stories in these very difficult circumstances. I think what's also been very helpful is that in talking to the mothers after the portraits about their portraits, it was very helpful for them to be able to see the images and to reflect on them themselves. It gave another layer of data that wouldn't have come through in interviews alone. So I think what this afternoon has shown is the power and potential of creative methods that wouldn't have otherwise revealed levels of data had we simply used talk or text. I'm sure Helen might have a comment as well.
Jim, thank you. I think that was really helpful, insightful comments about the value of arts-based methods. And I think a lot of us as presenters and also this very skilled members of the audience could have a really interesting conversation, I think, about their use. So I don't really have a lot more to say about them, because I feel there's so much to say. Other than that, and I think they do, as I use the quotation from Levy in my presentation, offer a space for children to reflect, or for anybody to reflect in their own time and in their own space, and that you can use that. Then that the images themselves are often incredibly valuable and in themselves as a way of initiating conversations, making connections with our research participants, in ways that in longitudinal research, which some of us are doing in these projects, stories keep coming back and they keep being reflected on through the, having started way back at the beginning of the project, we're still going back to the stories that elicit that those images point to at the start, and adding a richness and depth. I'll be quiet now. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. I think that just about wraps up our time for the Q&A. So it's just back to Hazel.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Well, colleagues, we've come to the end of this research seminar. I'd like to thank my colleagues for their presentations, to the research development team for all of the background work, and we all know how challenging that is, and to everyone for your participation. So I'd encourage you to join the HUD-CREST mailing list if you haven't already, and get in touch with the researchers after the event if you're interested in collaboration or using the findings in your own practice. And so, for now, good afternoon.